The first time Adelaide Collins noticed the tracks, she nearly dropped her lantern into the snow. It was the tail end of October in the year 1879, and the Wyoming Territory had already begun its merciless conversation with winter. Adelaide had stepped outside her cabin before dawn to check on her mule, Dorothea, because the animal had been coughing something wretched the night before, and the sound of it had pulled Adelaide from the thin, anxious sleep she had come to regard as her nightly companion since her husband Robert had died in the spring. She carried the lantern low against the wind, her breath making small white clouds in the darkness, her boots crunching through a skin of ice that had formed overnight over the mud near the door. And there they were, large boot prints, deep and deliberate in the fresh dusting of snow that had fallen sometime after midnight, circling the entire perimeter of her homestead in a single unbroken loop. They came out of the tree line to the north, moved along the east side of the cabin, past the barn, continued around the garden fence and the root cellar door, and returned to the trees from the south. Whoever had made them had not stopped, had not lingered, had not come close enough to threaten. They had simply walked the boundary of everything she owned, and then they had gone. Adelaide stood very still in the early dark and looked at those prints for a long time. She was 29 years old, alone on 160 acres of Laramie County grassland, 2 hours by horse from the nearest town of Caldwell Creek, and the nearest neighbor was old Hector Pratt, who was half blind and a full bottle of whiskey away from useless on his best days. She ought to have been afraid. She told herself she was afraid. But the lantern light caught the shape of those boot prints, their slow and steady spacing, their patient circuit around every building she owned, and what she felt rising in her chest was not fear but something she could not immediately name. She checked on Dorothea, who was feverish but breathing steadily, gave her some of the dried chamomile Adelaide kept for just such purposes, and went back inside. She did not sleep again. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of bitter coffee and watched the gray light grow at the window and thought about those tracks. Robert Collins had been a good man, if not an inspired one. He had brought her out from Ohio in the summer of 1875 when she was 25, and he was 31, full of talk about the land and what a man could build on it if he worked hard enough and kept his head straight. He had built this cabin with his own hands and the help of 2 brothers who had gone back east after the first winter. He had dug the well and put in the garden and bought Dorothea and 2 chickens and a hog, and he had worked the land with a seriousness that Adelaide had respected even when she had not always loved it. And then in March of 1879, while cutting timber on the north slope, he had caught a fever that moved to his lungs, and by the 1st of April he was in the ground in the small plot he had fenced off behind the barn, next to the stone he had put there for the baby they had lost in 1877. Adelaide had stayed because there was nowhere else to go. She had stayed because the land was paid for, and the cabin was solid, and the alternative was returning to Ohio a widow with nothing, and she had too much of her own particular stubbornness for that. She had stayed through the wet spring and the brutal summer and the cautious autumn, and she had learned things she had never imagined learning. She had learned to shoot the Henry rifle Robert had kept above the door, to set snares for rabbits, to mend harness leather, to read the sky for weather the way Robert had taught her in the year before he died. She had learned that loneliness was not one feeling but many different ones stacked on top of each other, some of them sharp, and some of them so dull they were almost comfortable. And now she sat at her table and thought about a man who had walked quietly around her home in the night and left his tracks as a kind of evidence that she was not entirely alone. 3 nights later, the tracks came again. She had stayed up late mending a pair of work trousers and had only gone to bed around midnight, and in the morning she found the same circuit in a fresh inch of snow, the same long stride, the same heavy boot, the same unhurried loop. This time the tracks passed very close to the firewood she had stacked against the east wall of the cabin, and she noticed that the stack was higher than she had left it. Not by much. perhaps 8 or 10 pieces of split oak laid neatly on top of the existing pile. She stood looking at it for a long time. She did not know whether to feel comforted or unsettled. She decided, after a considerable internal argument, that she felt both, and that both were reasonable responses. On her next trip to Caldwell Creek, which she made in the second week of November in a light snowfall with Dorothea pulling the wagon and coughing only occasionally, Adelaide asked around. She kept her questions casual, as though she were merely making conversation while she waited for the store owner, Gerald Foss, to total up her order of flour and salt and lamp oil. "Gerald," she said, watching him move the pencil down his ledger, "you know anything about a mountain man who keeps to the territory north of my spread? Big fella from the look of the tracks." Gerald Foss looked up at her over his spectacles. He was a comfortable man with a round face and the demeanor of someone who had heard everything twice. "North of your spread," he said. "That would put you up against the Laramie Range foothills. You could be talking about Abraham Conroy." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. "Is he dangerous?" Adelaide asked. "Dangerous?" Gerald considered this as though it were an interesting question about the weather. "I would not say dangerous. I would say private. He comes in here maybe twice a season for what he needs, speaks about 6 words total, pays cash and goes. Trapper mostly, some timber. They say he was a scout for the army back in the early 70s before all the trouble." Gerald paused and looked at her more directly. "He come around your place?" "I have seen tracks is all," Adelaide said. "Big boot, walking the perimeter." Gerald nodded slowly. "That would be his way. He watches out for the homesteaders on the edge of his territory when the cold comes." Widow Hannigan 2 valleys over said the same thing about him, that she finds fresh wood, and once he mended her corral fence in the night without asking. Never comes to the door, just does what needs doing. He put down his pencil. "Some people find it peculiar. I think it is the loneliest form of kindness I have ever encountered." Adelaide thought about that all the way home through the snow. She thought about it for days afterward. She thought about it while she fed the chickens and hauled water from the well and salted the last of the autumn pork and read by the fire until her eyes grew heavy. She thought about a man who moved through the dark like a conscience, mending what he could see was broken, walking the boundaries of other people's safety without being asked, and then retreating back into his mountains before the sun could witness him. She thought about what it would take to be that kind of person. What would have to break in you, or be built in you, for solitude to become your entire language? On the night of the 14th of November, a Thursday, she left a plate of food on the porch step. She had made a venison stew with the deer she had taken in early October and dried, and she ladled a generous portion into a tin plate and covered it with a cloth and set it on the top step before she went to bed. She told herself it was just a reasonable thing to do for a person who had been leaving her firewood. She told herself it was no different from leaving out feed for the barn cat. She told herself she was not hoping to communicate anything by it. In the morning, the plate was empty and washed clean and sitting exactly where she had left it, and beside it sat a brace of rabbit, freshly dressed and tied with a strip of rawhide. Adelaide picked up the rabbits and the plate and stood on her porch in the early light and looked at the tree line to the north for a long time. The sky was low and white with coming snow. A raven called from somewhere in the pines. There was no movement among the trees. "Thank you," she said, to the empty morning and whatever it contained. The weeks that followed developed their own quiet rhythm. Every few nights, sometimes every night when the cold deepened, and the wind came down from the mountains with real intent, she would find the tracks in the morning and some small evidence of care. Once the barn door latch, which had been sticking for 2 weeks, was replaced with a new iron piece, clearly hand-forged and perfectly fitted. Once a split in the cabin's north-facing wall chinking had been repacked with fresh clay and horsehair. Once 3 of her fence rails, which had been sagging under the weight of repeated snow and thaw cycles, were reset and reinforced with new support stakes driven into the ground with a precision that spoke of someone who had done such work for years. She began leaving food regularly. Not every night because she did not want to presume, but when she had something good, something that had taken real effort or that she was proud of. A pot of bean soup with salt pork and dried herbs from her garden, cornbread with the last of the summer honey. Twice she baked a proper loaf of bread, which she had not done for company since before Robert died, because bread required a kind of hopefulness she had not always been able to locate, and she found that the act of baking it and leaving it out on the step in the cold dark did something to her that she could not quite explain. It felt like speaking. It felt like saying, "I see you too." December arrived and the cold became absolute and serious. The temperature dropped to places Adelaide had not experienced in all her 4 years in Wyoming, the kind of cold that crept through every gap in the logs and turned the water in the bucket beside the door to solid ice by morning. She kept the fire burning all night, which used more wood than she had planned, and she was genuinely worried about running short before the season broke. She mentioned this to no one, because there was no one to mention it to. She simply recalculated her usage and accepted that she would be cold for some portion of the remaining winter. She woke one morning in the second week of December to find her woodpile doubled. Not just added to, doubled. Someone had split and stacked 2 full cords of oak and pine against the east wall, working in the dark and the cold, and had done it so quietly that Dorothea had not made a sound. Adelaide stood in the morning light with her hand pressed flat against the cold wood and felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed since April. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment. She breathed through it. And then she went inside and baked the best pie she knew how to make with the dried apple slices she had been saving and the last of her good cinnamon, and she left it on the step that night with a note folded beside it. She was not certain he could read. She wrote it anyway. She wrote, "I do not know how to thank you for the wood. I will not run out of warmth now because of you. I left the plate again because it is the only thing I have to give. Adelaide Collins." In the morning, the pie was gone and the note was gone, and on the step beside the clean plate sat a single small thing that made her go very quiet. A carved wooden figure of a woman standing straight and solid on 2 feet, no larger than Adelaide's palm, made from what looked like pine and sanded smooth with real care. And though it was a simple thing, a rough thing, it looked remarkably like someone standing alone in front of a small house and looking at the horizon without flinching. She kept it on the windowsill where the light hit it first in the morning. She wrote again the following night, leaving the note under the tin plate. She wrote, "The carving is beautiful. Did you make it yourself? I have been here 4 years. Before that I was in Ohio. I don't know what made you start watching over this place, but I find that I sleep better knowing you are out there, which is a strange thing to say to someone I have never met." She signed it the same way. She did not receive a carved response this time. She received 2 nights later a note of her own. It was written on a piece of brown paper in a deliberate hand, the letters large and careful as though he had thought about each one before setting it down. It said, "I can read and write. I was educated. I have been in these mountains 6 years. I walk the Homestead lines because someone should, and I am here to do it. I am glad the wood is enough. The pie was the best thing I have eaten in longer than I care to say. Abraham Conroy." Adelaide read that note 4 times. She sat at her table in the firelight and read it 4 times, and then she folded it and put it in the small wooden box where she kept Robert's watch and the button from her mother's good dress and the lock of hair from the baby who had not survived. She put it in the box because it was something worth keeping. She wrote back that same night. She wrote, "Abraham Conroy, Gerald Foss at the store told me your name. I should tell you that I was not afraid when I found your tracks, which perhaps should have alarmed me more than it did. I think I knew somehow they were not meant to frighten. My husband Robert died in April. Before that, we lost a child in 1877. I am telling you this because it seems unfair that you should know the outlines of my life from walking it every night, and I should know nothing of yours. What brought you to these mountains?" The answer came back 3 days later, and it was longer than she expected. He wrote, "I am sorry about your husband and your child. There is no adequate thing to say about grief of that kind, but I am sorry truly. What brought me here is a question with a long answer. The short version is that I was a scout with the Army from 1871 to 1875, and I saw things done in those years to the Lakota and Arapaho people that I was not able to reconcile with myself after the fact. I resigned my commission and came north and built a cabin on the ridge above the river because I needed to be somewhere the silence was large enough to think in. I do not say this to make myself interesting. I say it because you asked honestly, and I think you deserve an honest answer. I am 32 years old. I am not a dangerous man, though I have done dangerous things. I have never wanted anything that was not mine to want. Abraham." Adelaide sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant to choose silence as a form of penance. She thought about the Army's campaigns against the native peoples of the territory, about the things she had heard in town over the years, spoken with that particular casual brutality that made her stomach turn, and she thought about a man who had been part of that machinery and had found himself unable to keep winding the clock. She did not think it absolved everything. But she thought honesty had its own weight, its own kind of courage, and she respected the fact that he had offered it without being asked twice. She wrote, "I think honesty is harder to give than most things. Thank you for it. I do not think you are dangerous. I think you are the kind of person who carries what they have done rather than setting it down. There is something I respect in that, even when it is also something I think breaks people in ways they don't always notice. I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is strange. Do you ever think about coming to the door?" The answer took a week, which was long enough that she began to wonder if she had frightened him off. She checked the porch every morning with a feeling that she was careful not to examine too closely, and every morning the step held only the evidence of his nightly passing, the big boot prints circling in a fresh arc, the occasional small offering left beside the clean plate she remembered to put out each night. And then on the 22nd of December, which was the coldest night of the year so far and the day before Christmas Eve, she found his note on top of the plate. He wrote, "Yes, I think about it. I think about it more than is sensible for a man in my situation, which is to say a man who has given most of himself to solitude and does not know whether he remembers how to be a proper person in someone else's presence. I am not sure I would know what to say if I came to your door. I am not sure I have the right. I have no idea if you would want me to. But to answer your question honestly, yes, I think about it every night when I walk." Adelaide read that letter, and then she went to the door and opened it, and stood on the porch in the extraordinary cold of the December night with the lantern held up, looking into the dark tree line. She could see nothing. She said at a volume just above her own breath, "You have the right. You have always had the right." Then she went inside before she froze solid, and she wrote immediately, "Come on Christmas morning. I will have coffee and whatever I can put together from what I have. You do not need to say anything in particular. You only need to come. Adelaide." She left that note on the step with a weight of flat stone on top of it so the wind would not take it, and she went to bed, and she slept more deeply than she had slept in months. She did not sleep at all the night before Christmas. She was up before 4 in the morning and had the fire built high and the coffee on before dawn. She mixed and baked a batch of cornbread and used the last of a cured ham she had been saving, and she set the table with the 2 good plates Robert had brought from Ohio wrapped in his shirt, and she put a candle in the window, which was a thing she had not done since the first Christmas she and Robert had spent here when they had been young, and excited enough about everything to put candles in all the windows and sing to each other in a way that made her smile now to remember. She kept going to the window to look. She told herself to stop. She went back to the window. At 7 in the morning, with the winter light just arriving gray and flat through the snow clouds, she heard the creak of the porch step, the large, deliberate step of someone who was accustomed to moving quietly and was making a conscious effort to make noise so as not to startle. Adelaide stood in the middle of her kitchen and put both hands flat against her thighs and took a breath, and then she went to the door and opened it. He was taller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined him considerable. 6 feet and an inch or two more, broad through the shoulders in a way that was purely functional. A man built by years of physical labor in cold country rather than by any vanity. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with elk hide, and a hat that had been good once and had seen significant weather since, and he had a dark beard that had grown free all season and dark eyes under heavy brows that looked at her with an expression she would spend weeks afterward trying to name. Not hope exactly. Not longing exactly. Something that contained both of those and was also shadowed by a kind of caution that spoke of someone who had learned not to assume. He was holding the tin plate she left on the step every night. He had cleaned it again, as he always did, and was holding it out to her with both hands, and the gesture was so plain and so formal and so endearing that Adelaide felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire behind her. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Conroy," she said. His voice was low and a little rough from disuse, but steady. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Collins," he said. "I brought your plate back." "So I see," she said. "Would you like to come inside and have some coffee while you are at it?" There was a pause in which she watched something work itself out behind his eyes, and then he said, "Yes, thank you. I would like that very much." He had to turn slightly sideways to fit through her doorframe, which made her smile, and he took his hat off the moment he was inside and held it against his chest, and stood in her kitchen looking around with the focused attention of a man cataloging something important. She noticed that he took in the carved figure on the windowsill and said nothing, but something shifted in his face. She poured the coffee and they sat across from each other at her table, which had been the table where she and Robert had eaten every meal of their Wyoming life and where she had sat alone for the past 8 months. And the strangeness and the rightness of having someone on the other side of it moved through her like a chord. "I have been trying to think what to say to you," he said, wrapping both large hands around the coffee cup, "since you left that first plate of stew. What did you come up with?" He looked up at her. "Not much," he said, and the honesty of it made her laugh, a real laugh, the first one that had surprised her in a long time. The sound of her own laughter in the room felt like discovering a window in a wall she had thought was solid. "I am glad you came," she said. "I am glad you asked," he said. "I would not have presumed." "I know," she said. "I know that about you already." He looked at her steadily. "You do not know much about me." "I know you walked this land every night through the worst of the cold," she said. "I know you split 2 cords of wood before I thought to ask for them. I know you put a new latch on my barn door, and you mend what you find broken, and you have never once come close to the house in a way that felt like a threat, only in a way that felt like a hand on the other side of a wall." She paused. "That tells me something." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband's grave," he said. "I pass it every night. I always stop there for a moment." He seemed to be choosing his next words with real care. "I do not know why exactly. It seemed like something that deserved acknowledgement." Adelaide looked at her coffee. "He was a good man," she said. "He loved this land more than he loved most things. I think he would be glad it is still standing." "It is standing because you are strong," Abraham said. "I have been watching this place all season. I know what you have done alone. It is not a small thing." "You helped," she said. "A little wood," he said. "You did everything else." They sat together for 2 hours that morning, talking slowly the way people do when they have been alone for a long time, and have forgotten that conversation can be something other than purely functional. He told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about a father who had been a school teacher, and a mother who had kept a garden the size of a field, about coming west at 18 with 2 other young men from his town, both of whom had gone home within 2 years. He told her about the years with the army with a deliberate brevity that she respected, and she did not push, only asked the occasional question that she thought he could answer without opening wounds that were not ready to be opened. She told him about Ohio and about her own family, Her mother who had died when Adelaide was 17, and her father who had remarried quickly, and the stepmother who had been perfectly civil and perfectly cold. She told him about meeting Robert at a church social when she was 24, and about the way he had talked about Wyoming as though it were a kind of paradise, and about how it had taken her 3 years to understand that the paradise he was describing was real, but was not a gentle one, and that she had come to love it on its own terms rather than the terms he had promised. When he left, he put his hat on and stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "I will still walk the perimeter, if that is all right." "It is more than all right," she said. "I told you I sleep better for it." He nodded, and she saw the ghost of something that might have been a smile, and then he walked out into the gray Christmas day and crossed the yard to the tree line, and she watched until the pines closed around him. That afternoon she sat by the fire, and the sensation inside her was so unfamiliar after 8 months of various shades of grief and endurance that it took her a while to identify it. When she did, she sat with it quietly and did not try to talk herself out of it, because she was too old and too tired and too honest to do that kind of damage to herself. What she felt was simple and old as fire. She wanted to know him better. January settled over the Wyoming Territory like a judgment. The temperature in the early weeks of the new year dropped to figures that made Adelaide's thermometer seem inadequate for the task, the mercury sulking at the bottom of the glass in a manner that suggested it had given up on measurement. The snow came in 3 consecutive storms that arrived every 4 days like a disciplined army, and the drifts against the north side of the cabin reached the eaves. Adelaide kept the fire going around the clock and spent her indoor hours mending, reading the 2 books she owned until she had them memorized, writing in the journal she had been keeping since Robert died, and now writing letters to Abraham, which she left on the step each night along with the food. He came twice more in January, on the 8th and on the 24th. Both times they sat at her table for 2 or 3 hours and talked, and the talking became easier and deeper with each visit in the way that conversation does when 2 people discover they are genuinely interested in each other's minds, and not merely performing the ritual of sociability. On the 8th of January, he told her about the valley above her homestead, about the elk herds that moved through it in the deep cold, and the way the river froze from the banks inward, and the ice made sounds at night like something breathing. He talked about the land with a kind of reverence that she recognized from herself when she talked about the garden, a love that was not sentimental but was precise and careful, based on real knowledge of what a thing needed and what it cost. On the 24th of January, she told him about the baby, about the boy they had named Thomas, who had lived for 3 days in November of 1877 and been buried before the ground froze. And she watched Abraham's face as she spoke and saw in it the particular attentiveness of a person who understands that what is being offered is not the fact of the grief but the grief itself, and who receives it accordingly. Said when she finished, "I am sorry, Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice this at the same moment she did, and a careful stillness came over him, but he did not take it back. She said, "Thank you, Abraham," with equal deliberateness, and watched the stillness in him ease. In the first week of February, during a storm that lasted 4 days and sealed the cabin under 2 feet of new snow, Adelaide woke in the night to a sound she could not immediately place. She lay in her bed and listened, and the sound resolved itself into the rhythm of someone shoveling. She got up and wrapped herself in the heavy quilt and went to the window and looked out into the storm and the lantern she could see moving methodically along the path from the door to the barn, and then along the path to the well, and then back again, clearing the heavy accumulation so that she would be able to move in the morning without slogging through snow to her waist. She could not see his face in the storm and dark. She could only see the shape of him, that large and purposeful shape, working steadily in the worst of the weather. She pressed her hand against the cold glass for a moment. Then she went back to her room and pulled the quilt up and closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the fire and the knowledge of that shape outside, and she slept the solid and dreamless sleep of someone who is, against all the odds of their particular circumstances, held. In the morning when she opened the door, the paths were clear, and the firewood by the door had been restocked, and on the step beside the empty plate was a small folded paper. She opened it standing in the doorway in the early snow light. It said, "The storm will ease by noon. Keep the fire high until it does. I left extra wood. If you need anything, light a candle in the north window. I will see it. A." Adelaide went inside and lit a candle and put it in the north window, not because she needed anything, just to let him know she had seen his note and that she was all right, just to give the gesture back to him. She never knew whether he saw it. She imagined he did. He came to the door on the 14th of February without any apparent awareness that it was Valentine's Day, which was something Adelaide found she liked about him. He came because he had been in the hills for 2 weeks checking his trap lines and had not been able to visit, and when she opened the door he stood there looking at her with those dark eyes and said, "I wanted to make sure everything was sound." And she said, "It is. Come inside and have some dinner." And he came inside and took his hat off and they ate together at the table for the first time, proper hot food, a rabbit stew she had made that afternoon. And she set out her 2 good plates and the candle she had kept from Christmas Eve, and he looked at the table and then at her, and something moved across his face that she thought was wonder, plain and unguarded. He helped her wash the dishes afterward, which seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, the 2 of them standing at the basin, their hands in the same water, and the ordinariness of it felt almost unbearably intimate. Their hands touched twice by accident, and each time neither of them moved away quickly. When he left that night, he stood at the door for a moment longer than usual. He was looking at her with that careful, steady attention he gave to everything, and she could see him working something out, and she waited. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I've been thinking about things I do not have the right to think about, and I know that. I know you have been widowed less than a year, and I know I am not the kind of man who has much to offer a woman who has made something real here, and I know I live rough and apart and the world I have is not a gentle one, but I find I cannot be around you without—" He stopped. "Without what?" she said gently. He looked at her. "Without wanting more of this," he said. "More of the table and the fire and the talking. More of knowing how you think about things. I am not saying this to press you or to ask you for anything. I am saying it because it seems wrong to be as honest as we have been with each other in every letter, and then pretend to you that I feel no differently than I would about any neighbor." Adelaide looked at this man standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, and the cold air coming in around him and the firelight on his face, and she thought, here is a person who has spent 6 years learning the vocabulary of solitude and is slowly, carefully choosing to learn a different one. She thought about the tracks. All those nights of tracks, all that patient walking in the dark, that faithful circuit that had asked nothing and offered everything. "I do not want you to pretend anything," she said. "I do not want either of us to pretend. I will tell you plainly that I feel the same way and have for some time, and that the only reason I have not said so is that I did not want to presume anything about your feelings or your life." He was very still for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I did not expect that." "I know," she said. "I think you are not accustomed to things going in your direction." "No," he said, "I am not." "Perhaps it is time they did," she said. And she stepped forward and very deliberately took his hand, the large cold hand that had split all that wood and mended all those things and left all those careful offerings on her step, and she held it in both of hers. He did not move for a moment. Then his hand closed around hers, gently, as though she were something he was choosing to be careful with. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you would allow it." "I would allow it," she said. "I would welcome it." He came every Sunday after that, and sometimes on Wednesdays when his work permitted. He still walked the perimeter every night, or almost every night, because she knew from the tracks, but now when he came to the door in the daylight, he came as someone who was invited, who belonged in the space of her life. And the difference between the 2 versions of his presence was the difference between watching a river from the bank and standing in it. He was not an easy man in the sense of being uncomplicated. He had deep reserves of quiet that could, at first, feel like withdrawal until she learned to read them more accurately, to understand that his silence was not distance but depth, and that when he did speak about something that mattered to him, the words had been considered and weighted, and were therefore worth attending to. He had nightmares sometimes, she gathered, from things he said obliquely, and though he never described them, she understood that the army years still moved in him like weather under the surface of a frozen lake. She told him once in early March when they were sitting on the porch in a brief warm spell that felt like a promise from a season not yet arrived, "You do not have to carry all of it alone, you know." He looked at her sidelong. "Some of it is mine to carry," he said. "I know," she said, "but there is a difference between carrying something and being buried under it." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The things I was part of, the campaigns, the way the army pushed through the territories, and what that meant for the people who had lived there, I cannot undo any of it. I chose to leave, which was the right thing, but it was also too late and not enough, and I know that." "Yes," she said, because she would not diminish it by arguing. "But I think," he said slowly, "that the only way I know to live with it is to do what good I can find to do in the small ways that are available to me. Walk the perimeter, fix the fence, leave the wood." He paused. "Find something worth protecting and protect it." Adelaide looked at him. "Is that what I am?" she asked. "Something worth protecting?" He turned to face her fully, and the directness in his eyes was so unguarded that she felt it like something physical. "You are the most remarkable person I have been in the same room within longer than I can account for," he said. "Yes, something worth protecting. Something worth a great deal more than that." She reached over and took his hand again, which had become her habitual response to the moments when he said something that opened the distance between language and feeling and stepped across it. He squeezed her hand and they sat together in the pale March sun and watched the snow on the distant peaks catch the late light, and Adelaide felt, with a clarity she found almost startling, that she was happy. Not the complicated, qualified, conditional happiness of a person working very hard to be fine, but the simple, declarative kind. The kind that just was. He proposed to her on the first day of April, which was the anniversary of Robert's death and the one-year mark of her widowhood, and she would wonder later whether the date was conscious on his part or not. She asked him directly, and he said that it was, that he had wanted to acknowledge that year, not to rush past it or pretend it had not happened, but to honor it and then to ask what came after it. They were standing by Robert's grave in the small fenced plot behind the barn. Adelaide had put early crocuses there that morning from the bulbs she had planted the previous autumn, small purple and white ones that had pushed up through the last thin snow. Abraham had come with her and stood with her at a respectful distance, hat in hand, and they had been quiet together there for a while, which felt right to Adelaide, that the first person who understood her grief fully enough to stand in silence with it was also the person who would ask her to step forward from it. He said, "I do not have much to offer in the material sense. I have my cabin and my land and my trade and my work ethic, which is considerable. I have nothing that compares to what you have built here. But I am offering myself, all of what I am including the difficult parts, and I am offering you my word, which I have not given carelessly in my life. I am 32 years old and I have not wanted anything as specifically as I want a life with you." He paused. "Adelaide Collins, will you marry me?" She looked at him standing there in the thin April sun with the mountains behind him and the small grave at their feet and the cabin behind her and the whole of the land around them, and she thought about all the small threads that had led from a winter morning and a set of tracks in the snow to this moment, and she thought about what it meant to be a person who could still choose, who could still reach toward something new without betraying what had come before. "Yes," she said. "Abraham Conroy, yes, I will marry you." He exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding something in for a long time, and then he stepped forward and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with that expression. she had been trying to name since the first morning she opened the door and found him standing there, and she finally named it. Relief. As though she were something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking, and finding her had set down a weight. He kissed her then, careful and deliberate as everything he did, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and the April wind moved through the budding cottonwoods and carried the last of the winter away with it. They were married in June, on the longest day of the year, in the yard of the homestead by the minister from Caldwell Creek, a reed-thin man named Reverend Aldous Marsh, who rode out on a gray mare, and said the words with genuine warmth, and afterward stayed for the meal Adelaide had prepared with the help of her closest neighbor, Martha Pratt, Hector's daughter-in-law, who had come to be a friend in the way that frontier women become friends. Through the sharing of practical knowledge and hard seasons, and occasional genuine laughter. Gerald Foss came from the store with his wife Vera, who brought a jar of preserved peaches and cried during the vows in a way that suggested she had been hoping for this outcome since Adelaide had first asked about Abraham over the counter. Old Hector Pratt came too, half blind and wobbling but deeply glad, and he clasped Abraham's hand at the end with both of his and said, "You take care of her. She is the best kind of woman, the kind that sticks," which Adelaide found she did not object to in the least. Abraham wore a new coat he had made himself from elk hide, and he had trimmed his beard, and his dark eyes on her as she walked across the yard toward him were so steady and so warm that she forgot entirely about anything except the fact of him standing there waiting for her. When Reverend Marsh pronounced them married and Abraham kissed her, their small assembled company made a sound of collective satisfaction that was entirely disproportionate to its size and entirely appropriate to the occasion. That night, after the guests had gone and the yard was quiet, they sat on the porch together in the long summer dusk, Adelaide leaning against Abraham's shoulder, his arm around her, the mountains going purple and gold in the last light. The land was green and alive in its high summer fullness, entirely different from the white world in which their story had begun, and Adelaide thought about the tracks in the snow and the clean plate on the step and the carving on the windowsill, which sat inside on the kitchen windowsill still, in its same spot where the morning light hit it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "All through the cold, when I found your tracks in the morning, I would stand there looking at them before I did anything else, before I fed the animals or started the fire or any of it. I would just stand there and look at them, and I would feel," she paused, trying to get it right, "I would feel less like the last person on earth, which is what grief feels like sometimes, as though you are the last person on earth and everything is just maintenance and endurance and getting through the day. And those tracks said that I was not, that there was someone moving around the outside of my life even when I could not see them. Someone who gave enough of a consideration to walk the whole of it every night in the dark and the cold." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I do not know if you knew what you were giving me. I suspect you did not. I suspect you were just being who you are." He looked down at her for a long moment. "I think I knew more than I admitted to myself," he said. "I told myself it was just the right thing to do, and it was. But it was also that you were the only light I could see from my ridge, your lamp in that window, and I would find myself drawn to it in a way I did not fully examine." He turned her hand over in his and looked at her palm the way he looked at everything, with careful attention. "I am glad I walked toward it." "I am glad too," she said. He moved his things to her homestead in August, which was a process that took 2 trips with the wagon and revealed that he had accumulated rather less in 6 years of mountain living than might have been expected. He brought his tools, which were many and excellent, his trapping and hunting equipment, a small library of 6 books including a dictionary, and a volume of Shakespeare that had seen considerable handling, a hand-forged iron lamp that he had made himself, and the bed he had built from timber, which was a large and solid construction that barely fit up the stairs to the cabin's sleeping loft. He also brought his wood-carving tools, a set of small chisels and knives and gouges that he kept wrapped in a piece of leather, and which she had seen him use on several evenings at her table during his courtship visits, his large hands moving with unexpected delicacy on small pieces of pine or ash, the shavings falling onto the table while they talked. She had a second carving before the summer was out. A man and a woman standing side by side with their shoulders touching, no taller than her hand, set on the windowsill beside the first one. Abraham took on the work of the homestead with the same comprehensive seriousness he had brought to every task she had witnessed him do, and the effect on the place was considerable. He rebuilt the barn's north wall, which had been settling on its foundation, and reframed the doorway so it hung square. He dug a second root cellar for the following winter's stores and put in proper shelving. He extended the garden fence and turned twice the usual amount of earth in preparation for the spring planting, and he taught Adelaide, who already knew a great deal, how to read the early signs of winter, whether in the behavior of the elk and the formation of the clouds over the northern peaks. In return, she taught him things he did not know he needed. She taught him how to make bread properly, which became something he did with great pleasure and skill on Sundays. She taught him her grandmother's remedy for the cough that afflicted mountain men in the cold months, a preparation of pine resin and honey and dried elderberry that worked better than anything the doctor in Caldwell Creek offered. She taught him that a home was a set of small daily practices, not just a structure, and she watched him receive this lesson with the attentiveness of a person who had been waiting for exactly this education for a long time. They argued sometimes, because they were two people with strong views and the honesty to express them, and the arguments were generally about practical matters, about the best way to do some particular task, or about the right call in a situation that required judgment, and they worked through them with the same directness they brought to everything else, and what came out the other side was always stronger than what had gone in. On a November evening, the anniversary month of the tracks and the plates and the beginning of everything, Abraham came in from the barn in the dark and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Adelaide where she sat at the table with her mending, and something in his expression stopped her hands. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing bad," he said. "I was just out there checking on Dorothea, who was healthy now and had been for months under Abraham's careful management, and I looked at this window from the yard, the light coming through, and I thought." He stopped. "You thought what?" she said. "I thought that last year I was out there looking at this light from the ridge and I was so alone I had almost stopped noticing it," he said. "And now I am inside the light, and the difference between those two things is," he shook his head, "I do not have the word for it." Adelaide set down her mending and stood up and crossed the room and put her hands on either side of his face. This man, this large and careful and deeply honest man who had spent 6 years in the mountains learning how to be alone and was now learning, slowly and with great intention, how to be something else. "I have the word for it," she said. "Home." He put his forehead down against hers. "Yes," he said. "That is the word." November came back around, 1 full year from the first morning she had found the tracks, and Adelaide marked the occasion by making a stew very similar to the first one she had left on the step, and setting 2 plates at the table and lighting the good candle. And when Abraham sat down across from her, he looked at the table and then at her, and she said, "1 year ago tonight I left you a plate of stew on the step," and he said, "I know," and she said, "I am glad I did," and he said, with a simplicity that was entirely his, "So am I. That winter was easier than the last in every measurable way. They were warm because the woodpile was enormous and well organized. They were well fed because the garden had produced abundantly and the root cellars were full. They were well covered against the cold by the additional elk hide blankets Abraham had prepared through the autumn, and they were not alone, which made everything else a different order of thing entirely. Abraham still walked the perimeter sometimes. Not every night, not the compelled circuit of a solitary man watching over what he could not permit himself to enter, But occasionally, on the nights when the cold was clear and the stars were exceptional and he wanted to be outside in it, he would walk the boundary of their land in the dark for the pleasure of knowing everything was sound. Adelaide knew this because she would sometimes wake and feel the bed empty beside her and lie in the dark listening to the silence and knowing he was out there in it. And she would feel the same thing she had felt all through that first cold season, held. The particular, precious held of someone keeping watch. She would tell him in the morning, "You walked last night," and he would say, "Did I wake you?" And she would say, "No. I only felt you go." And he would look at her in that steady way and say nothing further, and the nothing was full of understanding. In the spring of 1881, their son was born. Adelaide labored through a long April night with Martha Pratt attending, and Abraham outside the door of the loft doing the thing that men in that time and place were expected to do, which was to wait and be useful with hot water and not interfere. But she could hear him on the other side of the door, not pacing in the frantic way of fear, but moving in the slow, deliberate way that she recognized. The same unhurried rhythm as those first tracks in the snow, back and forth, steady and present. And the sound of him was, in its way, the most comforting thing in the room. When Martha Pratt opened the door and said, "Come in, Abraham, you have a son," the sound he made was very small and utterly undone. And when Adelaide held out the infant to him, he took him with those large and careful hands and looked down at the small face with an expression so open and unguarded that Adelaide, exhausted and sore and more full of feeling than she had room for, had to close her eyes for a moment simply to contain it all. "Samuel," Abraham said, looking at his son. They had decided on the name together, from the Bible his father had taught from, and the word in Abraham's voice had the weight of something being said for the first time in exactly the right context. "Samuel," Adelaide agreed, watching her husband hold her son. The boy grew through his first year with the energetic purposefulness of a child who had been born to parents who understood what it cost to be here, who treated every ordinary day as worth showing up for. He was dark-eyed like his father and quick-minded like his mother, and from very early he showed an interest in the outdoors that made Abraham's face do things that Adelaide enjoyed watching tremendously. By Samuel's first autumn, Abraham had made him a wooden cradle carved with small animals, elk and rabbit and birds, and had begun the habit of walking with him in the evenings. The boy held against his chest, going around the homestead boundary in the dusk, pointing out the things that could be seen and learned, speaking in the low, steady voice that was his natural register, while the boy looked at everything with his wide, dark eyes. Adelaide would watch them from the porch sometimes, the large man and the very small boy, making their circuit of the land in the evening light, and the sight of it would move through her in a wave that was love in its simplest and most complicated form. In 1883, their daughter arrived, fierce and opinionated from the first hour, whom they named Clara after Adelaide's mother, and the homestead expanded again to contain her, both in the physical sense that Abraham added a second room to the cabin over the winter before she arrived, and in the emotional sense that children have of expanding every space they inhabit simply by being undeniably themselves. Samuel, who was 2.5 and deeply certain of his own authority, regarded Clara with the mixture of suspicion and fascination characteristic of small children confronting their replacement. And Abraham handled this with the same patient steadiness he brought to every challenge, spending deliberate time with Samuel every day, walking him to check the trap lines in the early morning, teaching him to identify the animals by their tracks, giving him the language of the land, the way his own father had given him the language of books. Adelaide watched her husband become a father the way she watched everything he did, with attention and with love. And what she saw was a man who had spent years in the deliberate practice of caring for things that could not ask for care, and had found in it a skill and a temperament that transferred perfectly to the care of small, demanding, irreplaceable human beings. They were not without difficulty in those years. The winter of 1882 brought a cattle disease through the territory that killed 2 of the 3 steers Abraham had purchased to diversify the homestead's income, and the loss set them back considerably and required careful adjustment of their plans for the following year. Adelaide took on additional sowing work for families in Caldwell Creek, and Abraham sold timber and took 2 months of scout work for a survey party mapping the northern range, which she did not love but understood was necessary, and was not the same as the army work, and he came back with his pockets full of surveyor's wages and a carved figure for each of the children. There was also, in the spring of 1884, an incident with a pair of brothers from the South who had decided that the homesteader in the Laramie foothills was an easy mark for some disputed cattle they wanted off their hands at someone else's expense. They arrived at Adelaide's door one morning when Abraham was out on the upper range and spoke to her with the particular patronizing confidence of men who assume a woman alone is a woman without recourse. Adelaide had sent them away with the Henry rifle from above the door and a vocabulary that would have surprised Reverend Marsh considerably. And when Abraham came home that evening, she told him the whole of it and watched his jaw set in the way it did when something had threatened his family. He spent the following 3 days making certain that the matter was resolved, traveling to Caldwell Creek to speak to the county sheriff and to various people who needed to know that the Conroy homestead was not a place to conduct that kind of business. The brothers did not return. It became a story they told in later years with the amusement that time grants to things that were not amusing at all at the time. Adelaide telling the rifle and vocabulary part, and Abraham telling his side with the dry understatement that was his humor at its best. And the children, as they grew old enough to hear it, were enormously gratified by the whole narrative. The seasons turned over each other, and the homestead grew and changed. Abraham's timber work expanded to a small operation employing 2 men in the summers, which gave him the income to invest back in the land and to build the larger barn he had been planning since the first year. Adelaide's garden became genuinely productive, supplying not only their own family but a steady trade to Caldwell Creek through Gerald Foss's store, dried herbs and preserved goods, and the particular apple butter she made in the fall that people in the surrounding valleys had opinions about. The carving tools came out every winter, and the windowsill filled up over the years with small figures that told the story of their life together. The standing woman, the man and woman side by side, a small boy, a smaller girl, a barn, 2 figures that were unmistakably a mule and an elk, standing next to each other with what appeared to be mutual respect. When Samuel was 6 years old, he asked his father to teach him to carve, and Abraham sat with him at the kitchen table and put a small knife in his son's hand and taught him with the infinite patience of a man who understood that some things are learned slowly and are worth learning slowly. And Adelaide sat across the table reading and listening to the sound of the knife on wood and the low exchange of instruction and question and response, and felt the particular happiness of a life that is both ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, that has accumulated its meaning in small daily deposits rather than in moments of drama. On the night of the first anniversary of their marriage, they had made a small private ritual of returning to the place where it had all begun, the porch step where the tin plates had been left and the notes passed back and forth, and sitting together in the dark for a while. They kept this up in the years that followed, this brief annual ceremony of sitting on the porch on their wedding anniversary and remembering the cold and the tracks and the beginning of the story. One such evening in the summer of 1885, their 6th anniversary, they sat on the porch in the long, warm dusk with Samuel asleep inside, and Clara also asleep after a heroic effort to stay awake, and Abraham's arm around Adelaide and the mountains dark and close against the pale sky, and Adelaide said, as she sometimes did when the mood was right, "Tell me what you were thinking the first time." He knew what she meant. "The first time I walked the perimeter here. The very first time." He was quiet for a moment. I had come down from the ridge in the late autumn, after your husband died in the spring. I had seen the lamp in the window all through the summer and watched the smoke from the chimney, and I knew you were here alone, and he paused. I was thinking about the winter, about what winter alone costs a person, and I thought I could do something about that without intruding on your life or presuming on your grief or asking for anything that was not mine to ask for. So you walked, she said. So I walked, he said. Every night, she said. Almost every night, he said. There were some nights, and the worst of it, when the cold was so absolute that even I stayed inside. But on those nights I looked from my ridge for your lamp, and as long as I could see it I knew you were all right. Adelaide absorbed this. You watched for my lamp all through the season, she said, even when you could not come down. Yes, he said. She turned to look at him in the fading light. Abraham, she said, you are the best man I have ever known. He looked back at her with those dark eyes, and the honesty in them was the same as it had always been, unchanging and unreserved. You are the best thing that happened to me, he said. Everything after you found my tracks is more than I deserved. Stop that, she said, not unkindly. You deserve everything good that happened. You earned it by showing up in the dark and the cold without being asked, and by being honest, and by being exactly who you are. He shook his head slightly, but she could see the corner of his mouth and the thing it was doing. Do not argue with me, she said. I am right about this. You are usually right about things, he said. I am always right about things, she said. You have had 6 years to learn this. 7, he said. I have known you almost 7 years. You were right about the root cellar and the bean crop, and the timing of the first frost last year, and whether the Pratt boy would make anything of himself. And Thomas Pratt did make something of himself, Adelaide said with satisfaction. He has a dry goods store in Laramie now. He does, Abraham agreed. You were right. They sat in the warm silence for a while longer, the mountains holding the last of the light, the crickets starting up in the grass, the cabin behind them containing their sleeping children and their accumulated life. I want to tell you something, Abraham said. Tell me, she said. It was the echo of what she had said to him, and he heard it and smiled. I walk the perimeter still, he said. You know this. I know this, she said. I walked it this morning before anyone was awake, he said. I do it now because I want to, not because I am afraid of what will happen if I do not. But I think I want you to know that the reason I do it is the same reason I did it that first winter. It is because everything inside this boundary is everything that matters to me in the world, and I want to know it is safe and sound. I want to know it myself, with my own feet, not as a task, but as he searched for the word. As a declaration, Adelaide offered. He looked at her. Yes, he said. As a declaration, every morning. Adelaide thought about the girl she had been in Ohio at 24, anxious and hopeful and full of a future she could not quite see, being taken west by a good man towards something she had never entirely envisioned, but had made her own regardless, through grief and labor and stubbornness and love. She thought about the woman she had been at 29, standing in the early dark with a lantern and a set of boot prints in the snow, and a feeling in her chest she could not immediately name. She thought about the woman she was now, 35 years old with 2 children asleep inside, and a man beside her who had chosen her with the same patience and deliberateness with which he chose everything, who had spent the better part of 2 years declaring his care for her in boot prints and split wood and repaired latches before he had ever said a word. Abraham, she said. Adelaide, he said. I love you, she said. Because it was simple and true and worth saying plainly on a summer evening, on the porch of the home they had made together. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of a person receiving something important. Then he said, I love you. I have loved you since before I knew what to call it. She took his hand, as she so often did, as she had done since the first winter and would continue to do for as long as she had hands to give. He held it as he always did, with care, with intention, with the particular tenderness of a man who understands the value of what he holds. The crickets sang in the warm grass. The mountains held the sky. Inside, the children slept their deep, untroubled sleep. On the kitchen windowsill, the small carved figure stood in the morning light that was not yet morning, waiting for another day to be seen. The candle in the window burned on. In the years that followed, the homestead became what both of them had always understood it could be. Not just a place of survival, but a place of genuine life, full and textured and growing. Samuel grew into a tall, dark-eyed boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's quick tongue, and who could track an elk by the age of 10 and recite poetry by the age of 11. Because Adelaide had sent away to Ohio for books and Abraham had inherited his own father's belief in the necessity of both kinds of knowledge. Clara grew into exactly the person her first hour of life had suggested she would be, fierce and vivid, and intensely committed to her own point of view, who could argue either of her parents to a standstill on any subject she cared about, and who cared about a great many subjects. Abraham's timber operation became a stable and respected business, employing 4 men by the late 1880s and supplying wood to the building expansion that was reaching through the territory as more settlers came in and towns grew. He was known in Caldwell Creek and the surrounding valleys as a fair man, a reliable man, a man whose word meant what he said it meant, which was the most important currency in a country where everything else could be taken by weather or luck or someone else's dishonesty. Adelaide was known for the garden and the apple butter and the particular directness of her conversation, which some people found startling and most people came to appreciate, and for the fact that she had homesteaded alone through a Wyoming winter and come out the other side with her land intact and her plans unrevised, which earned her a kind of respect that could not be purchased. Together, they became the kind of presence in a community that a community does not fully know it needs until it has it. People who had known difficulty and had not been hardened by it, who had arrived at happiness through honest work and honest attention to each other, and who therefore had something to offer that was not advice exactly, but something closer to evidence. Evidence that it was possible to build a real life in a difficult land if you were willing to be patient and honest, and to show up in the dark without being asked. On the night of December the 1st in 1888, 9 years after Adelaide had first found tracks in the snow around her homestead, Abraham came in from his evening walk of the perimeter and stood in the kitchen doorway in the same way he had stood that November evening 7 years before, looking at her where she sat at the table. The children were in the loft, both of them, and the house was warm and the lamp was full and the fire was high, and Adelaide looked up from her mending and saw his expression and set the mending down. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing bad," he said again, as he had said before. "What then?" she said. He crossed the room and sat across from her at the table, the same table, the table that had been Robert and Adelaide's and was now Adelaide and Abraham's and would someday be Samuel's or Clara's, the table that had been the center of more than she could account for. "I was walking the perimeter," he said, "and I was thinking about the first winter, about what I was and what this place was, about the distance between who I am now and who I was. And," she said. He looked at her across the table, steady and honest as always. "And I was thinking that I would do it all again," he said. "Every cold night, every plate on the step, every note back and forth, every piece of wood, every cautious step toward a door I was not sure I had the right to knock on." He paused. "I would do all of it again knowing exactly how it came out, and I would do it again if I did not know, because the direction of it was always right. It was always pointing here." Adelaide felt the familiar warmth move through her, the one that had started on a cold November morning with boot prints in the snow and had never entirely ceased. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "The direction was always right," she agreed. "I wanted you to know that," he said, "that there is nothing I would change, not the hard parts or the long parts or the uncertain parts. I would change nothing." Outside the cabin, the December wind moved through the pines, and the mountains held their enormous, indifferent silence, and the lamp in the window burned steady and clear into the dark, a signal and a welcome and a declaration all at once, visible from a very great distance to anyone who was paying attention. And in the morning, when the first snow of the season had fallen soft and clean across the homestead in an even white sheet, covering the paths and the garden fence and the woodpile and the small fenced plot where Robert Collins lay with his son beside him, there were tracks around the perimeter. Large boot prints, deep and deliberate, spaced with the same even unhurried stride of a man who was not afraid of the dark and was not in any particular hurry, because he had nowhere in the world he needed to be that was not right here. Adelaide found them in the morning when she went to check on Dorothea's successor, a younger mule named Josephine who was considerably more cheerful than her predecessor, and she stood in the early snow light looking at the tracks with her lantern low, and she felt exactly what she had always felt when she found them. Not alone, held, home. She went back inside and put the coffee on and called the children down from the loft, and listened to the sound the house made when it was full of people she loved. And when Abraham came in from the barn stamping the snow from his boots and hung his coat and sat down at the table and looked at her across the room with that steady, unhurried gaze that had been her north point for 9 years, she smiled at him. He smiled back, the kind of smile that did not need to be large to be the realest thing in the room. And the snow came down outside the windows, soft and steady, covering the tracks and everything else in a clean white silence, and the fire burned in the hearth, and the coffee was hot, and the children were loud, and the carved figures on the windowsill stood side by side in the early light, a man and a woman, shoulder to shoulder, facing whatever came next together. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.